Hello everyone, friends. I really want this episode to be seen by Western viewers and everyone who calls Russia an aggressor. Now look, with just one fact, I'm about to turn your understanding of what's happening upside down and make all Western propaganda about demonizing Russia completely meaningless. Here's the fact. The USSR, and later Russia, made several attempts to join NATO. That's it. I'm going to read to you now some recently declassified documents. Well, actually, this has already been in the press for a while, but the accompanying documents were classified at the time. It says, copy declassified. It used to be top secret. So, this is a note from the Soviet government from 1954, sent to the NATO member countries. It says the following. Guided by the unwavering principles of its peaceful foreign policy and seeking to reduce tensions in international relations, the Soviet government expresses its readiness to consider, together with the interested governments, the question of the USSR's participation in the North Atlantic Treaty. And here is the response. Here is the answer. Such proposals were accompanied by the idea of expanding the Atlantic Pact by having the Soviet Union join the North Atlantic Treaty. There is no need to emphasize the completely unrealistic nature of such a proposal. That's the answer. About a year ago, maybe, when asked whether it was possible for Russia to somehow join NATO, I said, why not? And immediately, former Secretary of State Ms. Albright, can't remember where she was, somewhere on a trip in Europe, said, but that's not up for discussion right now. Now, let's use basic logic. If the US and its vassals had responded to the proposal, there wouldn't be any war right now. There wouldn't have been a Cold War, an arms race, insane spending on weapons, or nuclear crises that almost wiped out humanity. This information gives a detailed answer as to who actually needs war. If Russia had been accepted into NATO, it would have adopted the alliance's rules. Formally, just like during World War II, the USSR and the US would have been allies and would have resolved disputes, so to speak, in a friendly manner. But no, my friends, no one wanted to see the USSR and later Russia as a partner. Why? Because in that case, the Anglo-Saxons wouldn't have a major adversary to demonize and use to scare their electorate, and the Europeans, which is important. In the first case, by frightening their own population, the US spends trillions of dollars on armaments. In the second case, under the guise of protecting their allies, the Europeans, the US occupies their territories. After all, what is NATO expansion? It's the occupation of territory in a military sense. And what's the point of expanding NATO if there's no adversary? That's the simple answer to why NATO is needed and why they don't want to make peace with Russia. So let's take a closer look at what NATO is, why it exists, how Stalin and Putin wanted to join NATO, and how instead of communists, NATO ended up recruiting Nazis. Today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is the largest military force in the world. It has concentrated up to 80% of the world's military power in its hands. NATO's armed forces number 3,360,000 personnel from 32 member countries, which together spend over $1 trillion on military expenses. The alliance was created as a defensive union based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. But it has never actually defended anyone. Yugoslavia, Libya, the Middle East as a whole, everywhere NATO troops show up, countries fall apart, wars break out, and people die. In the past 30 years, the NATO military bloc has carried out 23 military operations against other countries. Millions of civilians have become victims. Between 38 and 60 million people were forced to leave their homes. The damage to the environment and infrastructure exceeds several $1 trillion. In Yugoslavia alone, the bombings caused $542 billion in damage. The starting point for the creation of the NATO bloc is considered to be 1946, when former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his famous Fulton speech. In this speech, he acknowledged the leading role of the new hegemon, the United States, and also frightened Europe with the Iron Curtain. From Stettin to Trieste, an Iron Curtain was drawn across the entire continent. Behind this line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe, which fell into the sphere of Soviet influence and under the tight control of Moscow. He also emphasized in this speech that the entire English-speaking world was obliged to fight the Red Threat, By the way, the phrase Iron Curtain, which would eventually become associated with the Soviet policy, was borrowed by Churchill from Goebbels, one of the ideologists of Nazism. The position of the Soviet Union, on the other hand, was simple. It was creating a buffer of friendly states in Europe that would serve as a barrier against a sudden attack on the country. In other words, to prevent a repeat of June 1941, as well as other wars that mostly came from the West. At that time, the USSR was in ruins and required a lot of effort to rebuild. The Allies in the anti-fascist coalition were doing something similar in Western Europe. The United States adopted the so-called Marshall Plan and allocated $13 billion to help rebuild 17 European countries after the war. In return, however, Washington demanded that all communists be removed from power, that the principles of free trade be abandoned, and that both imports and exports be tied to the United States. As a result, Europe ended up divided. The eastern part was pro-Soviet, while the western part was pro-American. In 1947, American President Harry Truman would declare that America would do everything possible to contain the USSR while supporting and saving democratic regimes from communism. Simply put, he decided to secure for the United States the right to intervene in the affairs of the entire world. Thus, the Truman Doctrine obligated America to pursue a policy of wars, interventions, and massive military budgets. And all of this continues to this day. In addition, as probably everyone already knows, the United States was developing plans for total war with the Soviet Union. Just take Operation Drop Shot, for example, which called for dropping 300 nuclear bombs and 29,000 high-explosive bombs on 100 Soviet cities. And in the end, basically, it was on this Truman Doctrine that the NATO bloc was formed. Since April 4th, 1949, so to speak, this bloc has been officially presented as a supposedly peaceful and defensive alliance against external aggression. And, of course, the aggression they meant was from the Soviet Union. And look, friends, in that same year, Moscow actually offered the British government to take part in the creation of NATO. But, naturally, Moscow was refused membership in NATO. Friends, the Design and Engineering Technology Bureau, Savalmash, is almost completely built. The main amount of funds has been collected to pay the contractor for the work. Only minor finishing work remains. Overall, the company has successfully overcome this stage. By the way, one of the main rumors aimed against the company was that the building would never be constructed and the money would simply be stolen. They said it was just another scam. Meanwhile, this so-called scam was actually built with government support in the Special Economic Zone, Technopolis, Moscow, and also received a government assignment for import substitution. For example, take the same Modilek quadcopter, whose total lift from its 4 motors, rewound with Slavianka technology, is as much as 800 kilograms. And now the main task for the company is to successfully launch and start making money. As always, the deadlines are tight. There's literally just 1 month left. July will most likely be the last month before the final stage of funding, because after receiving the document confirming the completion of construction, the discount on shares will be significantly reduced. The company, Savalmash, will begin its official and full-scale operations and will already be generating profit from its activities. And until that moment, as you can understand, funds are still needed. These are funds raised from micro-investors, meaning regular, everyday people. After the company launches and starts making money, investors will begin to receive dividends. So, if you want to join an almost-ready business on favorable terms, follow the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. After this refusal, Joseph Stalin called the alliance an undermining of the United Nations, which, in fact, it was. In other words, this means that NATO is an act of subversion, an attack on real international law. Originally, 12 countries joined this North Atlantic alliance. In general, the United States could not enter into a military alliance unless it was at war itself. By law, so to speak. But for this purpose, they passed the Vandenberg Resolution, which made it possible to sign treaties during peacetime and to station military bases in other countries, something the United States began to do actively. Today, they control more than 900 bases around the world and spend about $100 billion a year on them. The anti-Soviet nature of the treaty, in fact, was never hidden, neither then nor now. NATO's first Secretary General, Hastings, put the organization's goals quite simply: to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. On the one hand, the NATO Charter calls for the peaceful resolution of disputes. On the other hand, according to Article 5, an attack on one NATO country is considered an act of aggression against all, and every member of the alliance is required to come to its defense. But because of the way the provisions are worded, several member states, including the US, can interpret a potential threat to their military bases as an attack. Considering there are more than 900 such bases, it turns out that NATO is responsible for the entire world. In this way, the alliance assigns itself the role of ensuring global security. And this, once again, contradicts the foundations of the UN-based international order. By the way, Article 5 of the NATO Charter was used only once, after the attack on the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001. That was when NATO troops entered Afghanistan. However, they left 20 years later, abandoning their allies and failing to defeat the Taliban. Now, here's another important fact. When Turkey and Greece were admitted to NATO in 1952, once again claiming the organization was peaceful, Stalin smirked and said, "So maybe we should join NATO too." And in fact, in 1954, the USSR officially requested to join the alliance. Moreover, as part of a peace initiative, he wanted to unite West and East Germany on the condition that the country would remain constitutionally neutral. For the Germans, this was quite a shock, because up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, they believed that only the Soviet Union was responsible for Germany's division. But the West refused. Supposedly, the participation of the USSR was incompatible with the democratic goals of the alliance. Even though Portugal, where a dictatorship thrived for almost 50 years, had no problem becoming one of the founding members. And in order to save face, NATO put forward conditions that Moscow simply could not accept, essentially, a capitulation in the Cold War, withdrawing troops from Germany and Austria, giving up military bases in the Far East, and limiting its armaments. In general, it's unlikely that the Soviet Union seriously believed it would be gladly accepted into the alliance. Most likely, it wanted to clearly demonstrate that all the talk about a peaceful NATO was meaningless, and that the alliance itself was aggressive and hostile. In other words, the Anglo-Saxons refused negotiations and peaceful coexistence right from the very beginning. Look at what happened. The Anglo-Saxons say, "We're supposedly building a defensive alliance against the USSR." The USSR says, "We're not planning to attack anyone. Let's be friends, and we'll join NATO too." The Anglo-Saxons were taken aback and, of course, refused. Who would we be uniting against then, and who would we use to scare our own people? And just think about how truly peace-loving the USSR was as a state. To avoid this confrontation, a possible future war, he went for unification with his enemy. In 1955, just 10 years after the victory over fascism, NATO accepted the FRG, that is, the American-occupied western part of Germany. Thus, the United States and its vassals, right after the end of World War II, immediately began creating a military bloc against the Soviet Union. To all the USSR's calls for peaceful coexistence, the states responded with refusals. Therefore, in response to this aggression, the Soviet Union and its allies, the socialist countries, created their own military bloc, the Warsaw Pact Organization, to ensure peace and security in Europe. So it turns out that the Soviet alliance, no matter how you look at it, was merely a response to the actions of the West. Here's an interesting fact about NATO. This organization has always presented itself, and still does, as a pure and noble defender of democracy, Western values, and basically everything good. Basically, just an angel guarding peace on Earth. But still, the average Westerner is never told whose services this bloc actually used. The most striking example is Nazi Lieutenant General Reinhard Gehlen, who, of course, fought against the USSR and, technically, against Britain and the United States as well. In 1945, Gehlen surrendered to the United States Army, but before that, he had secret documents, research from German military intelligence, various data, spy networks, and other valuable information. The cunning general figured the Americans would pay a good price for all this. And that's exactly what happened. As a result, Gehlen was tasked with organizing a department that would focus exclusively on the Russian question. So, in 1946, Gelenord was established, and instead of just one Russian department in the West, there were now two, one in the US, the CIA, and the other in West Germany, the Gehlen Organization. Both pursued the same goal, the destruction of communism as an ideology and the weakening of the USSR as a state. Later, by the way, Gelenord was transformed into the Federal Intelligence Service of Germany, which still operates today. By the early 1950s, more than 4,000 former Wehrmacht and SS officers were serving under Gehlen's command. Gehlen also played an important role in appointing NATO personnel. For example, the Nazi Heinz Speidel, a German lieutenant general, became the head of the Armed Forces Department of the West German Ministry of Defense in 1955, and from 1957 to 1963, he was the commander of NATO forces in Central Europe. From 1967, this position was held by Johann Kilmansegg. During World War II, he fought in Poland, France, and the USSR. The submariner Friedrich Hogenwerder, who sank 17 British and American ships, served for 4 years as Deputy Chief of Staff of NATO Command in Northern Europe. And then there's Wehrmacht General Adolf Husinger, who stood beside Hitler, a man whose orders led to the destruction of Soviet cities, who in 1961 actually became the head of the NATO Military Committee in Washington. Before that, he had served as the Inspector General of the Armed Forces of West Germany. Many other people from Gellen's circle also ended up in NATO's command structures, shaping its military and political direction. It's important to note that the Soviet Union demanded that the United States hand these people over, but without success. And by the way, after his retirement, the Nazi Gellen received $6 million a year in support from the Americans. That's the kind of symbiosis that developed between the Nazis and our former allies. But, as you can imagine, these people deserved the death penalty, yet their experience in fighting the Soviet Union was more important to the Americans. So they didn't care what kind of monsters they really were. In 1983, the question of the Soviet Union's membership in NATO was raised again. Here, it's important to understand that this membership, first of all, meant preventing a war, something the USSR had already experienced and wanted to avoid. Secondly, the USSR would have had significant influence within NATO, so this entry didn't imply any kind of subordination to the United States. But after the incident with the South Korean Boeing, this topic was never brought up again. Let me remind you, we're talking about accusations against the USSR that it deliberately shot down a passenger plane over its own territory. At that time, the United States called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and together with NATO countries, began preparing for nuclear war again. Throughout its history, NATO has expanded 10 times, 3 of those before the collapse of the USSR. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the very existence of NATO seemed to lose its purpose. But that wasn't the case. The alliance decided it had a new role, to keep order around the world, and move toward Russia's borders. There's a telling image showing NATO bases with a caption saying that Russia has placed its borders too close to NATO bases. And that's not a joke. In the US, people genuinely believe that it's Russia threatening NATO, simply because it's so close to their bases.
The Russian army is at NATO's doorstep. Why? Isn't it logical to conclude that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep because the alliance expanded, not because the Russians moved closer? In other words, the alliance moved right up to Russia, not the other way around. Isn't that a more accurate way to look at it?
I think President Putin probably sees it differently than we do.
But don't you think the alliance expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO did expand.
All right.
An expansion is a good thing.
So, you're moving closer to Russia, while at the same time accusing the Russians of being too close to you?
This is the perfect moment to recall that in 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker promised Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward if he gave up his allies in Europe. Gorbachev gave up his allies, but NATO said, "Shame on the losers," and went on to expand further, breaking their word. And this isn't made up, these are documented negotiations. If we maintain a presence in Germany, which is already part of NATO, NATO's jurisdiction will not expand even an inch to the east. This was said at the time when the issue of German reunification was being decided. And here's Baker himself, standing next to German Vice Chancellor Genscher, who says, "We agreed that there is no intention to expand NATO's defense zone to the east. This doesn't just apply to East Germany, which we don't want to include, but in general." Gorbachev was also assured that the alliance posed no threat to the Soviet Union by British Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, French President François Mitterrand, and US President George H.W. Bush. But there's one small problem. There were guarantees, but they were only verbal. Legally, they weren't formalized in any way. Gorbachev and his team were so dazzled by the West that they took its word for it. Gorbachev himself refused to acknowledge the deception in 2014 and said there were no promises made. Supposedly, it's all just a myth. By doing so, he fully supported the Western position and propaganda, and he blatantly lied to everyone. There are documented records showing that all of this was said to him. Here's an interesting detail from a declassified archive of the U.S. National Security. Russian President Yeltsin tells US President Bill Clinton that Russia should be the first to join NATO, and only after that should other Central and Eastern European countries be allowed in. In 1994, at his dacha in Novo Ogaryovo, Yeltsin described his vision for the future world. There should be a kind of cartel between the US, Russia, and the Europeans to help ensure and strengthen international security. But instead of accepting Russia, NATO launched the Partnership for Peace program for military cooperation. In that same year, the First Chechen War began, when Russia tried for the first time to stop separatism in the Caucasus. For the West, this was a signal that the breakup of Russia was being postponed, and that Moscow, despite its dire situation, would defend the country. The question of NATO was closed again. Even though the West acknowledged that Russia was fighting not just separatists, but terrorists who, as it turned out, were secretly being funded by the West itself. Meanwhile, the alliance began absorbing Eastern Europe, countries that had previously been part of the Warsaw Pact, and kept moving closer to Russia's borders. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. Then, in 2004, the bloc expanded to include not only former socialist countries, but also former Soviet republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Think about it, this is already a direct occupation of our homeland, of Greater Russia, beyond whose borders our grandfathers died. In fact, the expansion significantly strengthened NATO's position in the Black Sea region and in southeastern Europe as a whole, which created serious risks for Russia. This was the point of no return, which showed that attempts to build a partnership were doomed to fail. Then, in 2008, NATO decided that Ukraine and Georgia should join the alliance. The expansion is still ongoing. Finland joined in 2023, and Sweden in 2024. And after the collapse of its main adversary, NATO has doubled in size. And here, I'd like to recall the words of the American diplomat George Kennan. He was, at one time, the ideological father of the policy of containing the USSR and the Truman Doctrine. In 1997, he predicted that NATO expansion would be a tragic mistake in the beginning of a new Cold War. There are no reasons to expand the alliance. Russia's reaction will be hostile and will lead to changes in its policies. In other words, the Western elite was well aware of what their aggressive policy would lead to. But this is a classic example. You go up to a beehive, stir it up, and then shout, "See, I told you the bees are aggressive." It's the same story with Russia. If you look at the official list of NATO operations, all of them took place in the 1990s. That was when there was no longer an opponent to restrain the ambitions of the alliance. All paths to world domination opened up for the United States. They started acting actively, and often without the approval of the United Nations. For example, like in Yugoslavia in 1999. As soon as the Serbs tried to restore order on their own land, the alliance immediately launched an operation. The country was bombed for 78 days, and they even used depleted uranium shells. More than 5,000 people were killed, 2/3 of whom were civilians. And all of this was nicely called a humanitarian intervention. In 2003, Iraq was next in line. They invaded under the pretext that the country possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a threat because of Saddam Hussein's regime. No such weapons were ever found. Hussein was killed. This war lasted almost 9 years, claimed the lives of 1 million Iraqis, and led to a surge in terrorist activity. In 2011, so-called peacekeepers invaded sovereign Libya, helped kill the head of state Muammar Gaddafi, and plunged the country into chaos that continues to this day. Up to 30,000 people died during the fighting. And in 2014, they started bombing Syria without UN approval, supposedly fighting terrorism and searching for chemical weapons. But in reality, they wanted to overthrow the country's president, Bashar al-Assad. Over the years of war, according to various estimates, up to 1 million Syrians have died. And of course, there are the 20 years in Afghanistan, where, thanks to NATO, about 50,000 civilians were killed and millions became refugees. Besides direct involvement in conflicts, NATO forces also act indirectly, for example, against Russia. They can't attack Russia directly. They only attack weak countries. Naturally, when it comes to strong opponents, they organize internal protests, train revolutionaries, supply weapons to the so-called opposition, and provide other support to rebels. For example, the United States and Turkey assisted Chechen militants and even taught them modern guerrilla warfare. As for the neighboring country, everyone already knows what's going on there. NATO membership is not cheap. The budgets are formed from contributions by the member countries of the alliance. According to the charter, they are required to spend 2% of their GDP. This year, NATO's military spending will increase by another 18% and will amount to about $1,260 billion. And that's more than half of the world's total military expenditures. This is good for the Americans, as NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg points out, since 2/3 of the money goes toward military orders in the United States. In other words, for the US, NATO is not just a tool of military hegemony, but also a mechanism for funneling money from Europe into its own military-industrial complex. So, NATO members end up paying for their own occupation and boosting the American defense industry. Meanwhile, with the kind of money circulating within the organization, it would be easy to end world hunger. For example, the United Nations came up with a plan for $6.6 billion that would save 42 million people from starving to death in 43 countries. That amount is 190 times less than NATO's expenditures. And let me repeat, if, hypothetically, NATO had agreed to admit the Soviet Union, then indeed, the money spent on armaments could have been directed toward good causes. But instead, the alliance is increasing military spending even faster than during the Cold War years. NATO countries are essentially the Golden Billion, the richest nations of Europe, led by the United States. They created this bloc to maintain their dominance and status. As has been said, Russia joining NATO would have made the organization meaningless. That's why, even back in 2000, Vladimir Putin said he would like to join NATO, provided that they would take Russia's interests into account. Then, in 2002, there was another attempt. According to the president, this was also discussed with Clinton. But Washington doesn't need a member whose military power is comparable to that of the United States itself, because that would upset the balance. And it's important to understand that the bloc was essentially put together in the interests of the United States, and Americans have always played the leading role in it. NATO Secretary Generals may change, yesterday a Brit, today a Norwegian, but the supreme commanders have always been Americans. There haven't been any exceptions yet. At the NATO summit in 2016, Russia was recognized as the main security threat, and containing it officially became the alliance's new mission. And this, I repeat, came after 4 attempts by our country to join NATO. But nevertheless, Russia still tries to negotiate. In 2021, Vladimir Putin proposed a treaty on security principles in Europe to the US and Europe. In response, NATO reaffirmed its commitment to the open-door policy. In other words, it made clear that it wasn't going to stop expanding toward Russia's borders. Once again, Russia was basically told to get lost. And then came 2022, and unfortunately, what the Anglo-Saxons had been working toward since the Cold War finally happened. So that's how things stand, friends. Be sure to share this video and subscribe to my Telegram channel. All the links are in the description. That's all for now. Take care.